this morning. I thank you for receiving our worship. I thank you for hearing our prayers. And now, God, we will pray the prayer together that you taught us to pray. Our Father, who art in heaven, hallowed be thy name. Thy kingdom come, thy will be done, on earth as it is in heaven. Give us this day our daily bread, and forgive us our debts, as we forgive our debtors. And lead us not into temptation, but deliver us from evil. For thine is the kingdom, and the power, and the glory, forever and ever. Amen. Wow, closed my eyes and pray, and when I opened them, there was light. Wow, that's now I'm going to have to put my sunglasses on. No, So there's this pastor who always used the phrase, "It might be worse," when some calamity would come his way. One day a friend said to him, "I have something to tell you, and you won't be able to use your favorite phrase." The man said, "I dreamt last night that I died and I went to hell." And the pastor said, "Might be worse." "Man, how could it be worse?" he said. "It might be true." Oh,
that's a good one.
You like that one?
Wow.
So there was this. I'm going to give you a second one.
Back up.
Only because that one, I mean, not because there was anything wrong with the first one. It's just that this is Palm Sunday, so I want to do something special and give you an extra one. So this says, there was a small group of people shipwrecked on a desert island in the middle of the ocean. After many weary months, a passing ship saw their plight and sent the boat ashore. But the boat did not land at once. One of the sailors threw a bundle of newspapers on the beach, shouting that they were from the captain, and said, "After you've read them, he wants to know whether you still want to be rescued." That one is the one that I feel like a lot of times in the last year or so is that maybe it would be better if we were just on some deserted island someplace all by ourselves and didn't have to worry about everything that has happened and is going on. But we do have to deal with these things. We don't get to just go off on an island, at least most of us don't. And one of the things that happens as we're going through the Gospel of Mark is that eventually you have to get to the crucifixion. And if you would come today, like some people I know, who were looking forward to a kind of a joyful, happy sermon, come back next week, because this week's not going to really be like that. This is crucifixion. And one of the things about the crucifixion is that, and we have to realize this, is that it was intended to be the cruelest form of punishment they could come up with that caused the most amount of suffering in a human being. And that's just the way it is with the crucifixion. You can't make it better. You can't make it any different. It was, in fact, designed to be that kind of a punishment. As far as the people doing it was concerned, the more they could make you suffer, the more they could make it hurt, the more they could do to you, the better for them. I'd probably bring it up again too, but the crucifixions were not done in some backyard somewhere out in the middle of nowhere. They picked a place, they found the busiest road they could find, they put it up on a hill, and they put the cross there, and that's where they did the crucifixions. When they wanted people to see what was going on with these people. For their purposes, a crucifixion was a horrible, terrible thing. And it was intended to be. And so keep that in mind as we're reading the things that we're reading today. Last week I started off by reading 1 Corinthians chapter 15, and I'm going to do that again this week because this is the main thing that we talk about. The main thing is to keep the main thing the main thing. And most of you have heard that enough to where as soon as I say the main thing, you just fill in the rest. And so, but this is the point of everything that we do. It's the foundation of everything that we do as Christians. So, in 1 Corinthians, Paul says, "Now, brothers and sisters, I want to remind you of the gospel I preached to you, which you received and on which you have taken your stand. By this gospel you are saved, if you hold firmly to the word I preached to you. Otherwise you have believed in vain. For what I receive, I pass on to you as of first importance, that Christ died for our sins according to the Scriptures, that he was buried, that he was raised on the third day according to the Scriptures, and then he appeared to Cephas and then to the 12. This death, burial, resurrection, and Paul says there, it's all according to the Scriptures. And when we talk about the Scriptures, just remind you again, that he's not talking about the Gospel of Mark. He's not saying according to what Mark wrote or what Matthew wrote. He's saying according to the Scriptures for him was the Old Testament. And what we're going, last week we looked at a passage in Isaiah, and today we're going to look at Psalm 22. And when we read the first line of Psalm 22, you're going to realize why, because Jesus quotes this psalm from the cross. And Psalm 22 is a psalm of lament, of struggle, that the person who's writing it is suffering. And he's calling out to God to do something about that suffering. And that's what Jesus is going to do on the cross. So Psalm 22 says, my God, why have you forsaken me? Why are you so far from saving me, so far from my cries of anguish? My God, I cry out by day, but you do not answer, by night, but I find no rest. Yet you are enthroned as the Holy One. You are the one Israel praises. In you our ancestors put their trust. They trusted you, and you delivered them. To you they cried out, and were saved. In you they trusted, and were not put to shame. But I am a worm and not a man, scorned by everyone, despised by the people. All who see me mock me. They hurl insults, shaking their heads. He trusts in the Lord, they say. Let the Lord rescue him. Let him deliver him, since he delights in him. There's more to it, and we could go through the next 20 verses or so, and there's lots of things that are in there that we would recognize if we saw when we read the message of the cross. The reality is that this is the thing that Jesus is referring to from the cross. He says, my God, why have you forsaken me? As he hangs on that cross. And that is supposed to remind us of this whole psalm. One of the things that's interesting is the last couple of verses here, the emphasis on mocking. And that's going to come out today as we read this, is that for Mark, it's almost like the physical part of it wasn't really the issue. He's going to go through every person who's around the cross, and every one of them is turning their back on Jesus, including, we can argue, the Father. So here's Jesus on the cross, and it's not just that he is suffering from the nails in the hands or the crown of thorns or the flogging that he had. It's that nobody is giving him any emotional support. He's hanging on the cross alone, all by himself. And so watch for that as we read Mark chapter 15. I'm going to be reading this and making some comments, but primarily it's the job of us today to hear what this is saying and just try to imagine watching Jesus as he hangs on the cross. Starting in verse 15, just to remind you where we were last year with the trial, or last week with the trials, in verse 15 it says, wanting to satisfy the crowd, Pilate released Barabbas to them. He had Jesus flogged and handed him over to be crucified. Now for Mark, that's all he says. He doesn't describe the flogging. He doesn't say how long it lasted. He doesn't know who. He just says he was flogged and taken over. But the interesting, but part of it is Pilate doesn't even really care whether Jesus is guilty or not. It starts off by saying he's only doing this to satisfy the crowd. It's the only reason why I tell jokes at the beginning of the sermon. to satisfy the crowd. Because if I don't, somebody will bring it up and complain. But that's the way a lot of times it happens when you're in public leadership is that a lot of things you're tempted to do just because everybody wants you to do it. And one of the hardest things to do, actually, to be a leader, is to stand against the crowd and say, no, I know you want to go this way, but that's not the right way. This is the right way. And so it's hard for leaders to do that. And as we are reading this, we see that Pilate, but that's the start of even the mockery. Jesus is hanging on the cross, and the person who puts it there, it puts him there just to satisfy everybody else. I kind of read this as Pilate literally doesn't care what happens to Jesus. He doesn't care if Jesus lives or dies. So that's the first kind of a mockery that we have. Pilate, there's a tradition that Pilate later on retired from this and went home, and then 20, 30 years later, somebody went to Pilate and said, do you remember that guy back in Jerusalem so many years ago that the Jews wanted to, and you released Barabbas, and remember all of that? And Pilate says, no, I don't remember any of that. Are you sure I did that? Because I don't remember. And that's kind of the way Pilate is portrayed here, is that totally indifferent to what's going on with Jesus. Jesus could die on the cross or not die on the cross. Pilate doesn't care. He practically forgets him the minute this is all over. And so that's the first kind of mockery that we see. In verse 17 it says, or verse 16, I didn't read verse 16 yet, it says, the soldiers led Jesus away into the palace, that is the praetorium, and called together the whole company of soldiers. Probably the whole company of soldiers represents a couple of hundred soldiers. They put a purple robe on him, then twisted together a crown of thorns and set it on him. And then they began to call out to him, "Hail, King of the Jews!" Again and again they struck him on the head with a staff and spit on him. Falling on their knees, they paid homage to him. And when they had mocked him, they took off the purple robe and put his own clothes on him. Then they led him out to crucify him. So the first thing happens is, it's not good enough for the soldiers just to crucify him. First they have to go through this mockery. They have to make fun of him. They have to beat him with sticks. They spit on him. Some of the other Gospels talk about pulling out his beard and putting that crown of thorns, pushing it down his head so he's bleeding. You just start to see that Jesus standing there by himself with several hundred soldiers around him, all taking their turns at him. But again, the physical nature of it isn't really the thing for Mark. It's just making fun of him. You're really the king of the Jews? Here, let's put this robe on here. We'll put your crown on, and we'll give you this scepter. And at the same time, they're just abusing him with words, emotionally and spiritually. And Jesus just stands there and has to take it. What's he going to do at that point? Nothing he can do. Just receive the punishment, both physically and emotionally. Then in verse 21, it says, a certain man from Cyrene, Simon, the father of Alexander and Rufus, was passing by on his way in from the country, and they forced him to carry the cross. Sometimes the gospel, if I could talk to Mark, I would say, why don't you give us a little more information here? Because this Simon guy and Alexander, who are these guys? Simon, Alexander, Rufus, there are other Simons, but Simon's a very common name. Rufus is mentioned, there's other Rufuses mentioned in the New Testament. We don't know anything about them other than they were coming from outside the city, coming into the city, and with that would be great. I would drive up to Portland, and you get into Portland, and as soon as you get into town, somebody stops your car and says, come on, you're going to carry this cross for them. And it's like, who is this? I don't have any idea what's going on here. And this is it. That's all that Mark mentions. They grab this guy and say, carry this cross. And Mark tells it almost like we're supposed to know who these people are. And it's very likely that the people that first read Mark did know who they were. They could go to talk to Alexander and Rufus and say, you were there when Jesus died, weren't you? And they would say, yeah, we saw it all. In fact, our dad, Simon, carried the cross for him. And they would have a very personal interaction with this whole story. They would have seen what happens there and told other people about it, which is what Paul says in Corinthians. For I receive from people like that what I'm passing on to you. It just gives an authentic feel to it when he brings up these names. And one of the things that Jesus had said to his disciples earlier was, you need to follow me. You need to deny yourself and take up your cross. Simon literally takes up the cross. It's just a little tiny reminder of what Mark wants us to get as disciples. That in some way we're supposed to experience a little bit of what Jesus went through. Not because we need to, it is anything for us, but just so that we can understand what it is that Jesus did. Remember we talked a couple weeks ago about Gethsemane and Jesus praying that this cup would pass from him. The cup, very likely, in my opinion, was the temptation for Jesus at any time during all of this, just to say, no, I'm done with this. I'm not doing this. This art. Look around. Look at all those people around. Why would I do it for them? What is it about them? And the answer is, of course, there's nothing about us. Jesus does it out of his love and grace, and he also does it out of obedience to the Father. And when we read these kinds of things, and then we look at our things in our own life, we're supposed to come to that same conclusion. Sometimes I do things, or I need to obey God, even though everything else about me says, no, I don't want to do that. That person doesn't deserve it. That person isn't worth my effort here, my suffering, my service, my giving up something, my forgiving them. Whatever it is that God says to you, you need to do, a lot of times we think, well, sure, I'll do it as long as the other person deserves it. But then we realize that that's not what Jesus does. Jesus does it because we need it, not because we deserve it. And that's what's going on with Jesus. Verse 22. They brought Jesus to the place called Golgotha, which means the place of the skull. Then they offered him wine mixed with myrrh, but he did not take it. And they crucified him. Dividing up his clothes, they cast lots to see what each would get. Again, just like the flogging, he said they flogged him. No description. They crucified him. No added details. No, either you know what a crucifixion is or you don't. Either way, the point is, for Mark, while he's put up on the cross and while he's starting to suffer from the pain of being on the cross, he looks down and here's the soldiers casting dice, casting lots for his clothing. Everything he has now is taken from him. Even his clothing is gone. He has nothing. He's hanging on the cross, and the soldiers, it's like they put him up there and then they ignore him, just like Pilate does. There's just this constant abandonment as we go through this. Pilate sends him off to be crucified, goes and does whatever else. The soldiers mock him for a while, put him on the cross, and then they're busy doing other things. Here's Jesus dying for all people everywhere, including those soldiers, including Pilate, and they're not even paying attention. They're not even looking. They're just going to wait for him to die. They cast his clothes. It says they offered him wine mixed with myrrh. There's a lot of discussion about this because for some people this was some kind of sedative that was supposed to make it easier or they wouldn't feel as much pain. But the problem is myrrh doesn't do that. When you put myrrh in, it's more like an upper. It actually makes you more sensitive to pain. And there's a real, I think the idea here is they were giving him something to make the suffering worse, not better. The soldiers are not interested in making this an easier time for Jesus. They only care about making it worse. And so Jesus doesn't take it because he knows that that's what it is. That this is not something, they're not being kind to him. That's one of the things that, as we're going through this, we kind of try to let's find some compassionate thing going on here. Let's try to find some way that the soldiers are going to make this better or easier. But the soldiers aren't interested in that. They only want suffering. That's all. And if they can do something to prolong it, then they will. That might be part of what the myrrh was there too, was to make him hang on the cross for longer. You keep him alive longer. It's not going to work, and Jesus, well, it didn't work because Jesus didn't drink it. But the issue here is that, again, we want to be seeing the crucifixion for what it is, a horrible, terrible thing, and there is nobody trying to make it better. If anything, they're trying to make it worse, make it harder. Verse 25. It was 9 a.m. when they crucified him. The written notice of the charge against him read, "The King of the Jews." And they crucified 2 rebels with him, one on his right and one on his left. So, 3 of them go up on the crosses. The most likely identity of these 2 rebels is that these were 2 associates or part of Barabbas' gang. Because remember, Barabbas is supposed to be up on that cross. So those 2 guys go up on the cross, and they're expecting their friend Barabbas to be in the middle, and guess what? He's not there. Makes you feel good about that, wouldn't it? You get crucified, but Barabbas doesn't. That doesn't seem right. But that's probably what happens. And again, in other Gospels, I think it's Luke that talks about the one thief that is mocking Jesus, but the other one says, it indicates that he believes in Jesus, and Jesus says, you'll be in paradise. But see, Mark's not going to do that. Because Mark's not interested in giving us anything that makes the picture here easier to bear. There's nothing good that happens here, except that Jesus is going to die on the cross for our sins. But it's the suffering that's part of all of this. In fact, it's later going to talk about both of these guys hanging there are using their last breaths to shout insults at Jesus. That's one of the things that we'll see here is that Jesus is going to cry out. But one of the most difficult things to do on the cross is cry out, because you can't breathe. That's the point. Your arms are up like this, and you're sagging down, and you pretty soon you can't get any air out of your lungs. But Jesus is going to cry out loudly twice, which shows a superhuman kind of a thing that's going on here. Because normally, other than maybe sobbing, there was no sound from the guys on the cross. He just didn't have the breath. The next verse says, "Those who passed by hurled insults at him, shaking their heads and saying, 'So, you who are going to destroy the temple and build it in 3 days, come down from the cross and save yourself.'" That was the accusation that the chief priest did. "You don't look like much up there, Jesus. You said you were going to destroy, the temple was going to be destroyed. You said you said all these things, but look at you. You're up on that cross. I don't see any temple getting destroyed. I don't see any temple being rebuilt. I don't see any future for you at all, Jesus." That's what people were saying, mocking and insulting. And remember, this is right along a major road, and people are walking by, and they can see Jesus up there. Many of the same people who just a few days before had seen him teaching in the temple, had seen him ride into Jerusalem, and in the midst of all the crowds cheering. How quickly it turns, they would probably be thinking. A week ago, you were a king in making, and now you're on a cross. You have to remember, too, that the cross is not it's a symbol for us of something that happened good, but at the time, the cross is a negative thing. If you're on the cross, it's because you're a criminal. It's because you're a bad person, not because you're a good person. You have rebelled against the state. You have rebelled against other people. You have committed some really bad crimes. It would be like today if we wore a rope noose around our neck and celebrated the fact that somebody was hung. As we're going to see later, this is why the cross was such a weird thing to people back in those days. To wear a cross would be to say, you're worshiping or you're celebrating a criminal. Why are you doing that? That doesn't make any sense. That's not the way it works. You want to go for it. You want to be worshiping a saint, not a criminal. But the mockery of that, the insulting, started at the cross. And the first group is this crowd of people. And then in verse 31 it says, in the same way, the chief priests and the teachers of the law mocked him among themselves. He saved others, they said, but he can't save himself. Let this Messiah, this King of Israel, come down from the cross, that we may see and believe. Those crucified with him also heaped insults on him. The crowd is mocking him, insulting him. Then the chief priests come by, and they're mocking and insulting him. And even the people on the cross with him are mocking and insulting him. There's nobody saying anything good. There's nobody doing anything positive about all of this. And the chief priests say, all right, we are waiting for a sign. Just come down from that cross, come on down here, and show us who you are. And so the irony of it is that Jesus is on the cross showing us something about God, but the chief priests and the crowds and the people there don't see it. The helpful thing, too, is when you see this part about saving, he saved others, but he can't save himself, is the idea that the word save also means, it can be translated to heal. He healed others, but he can't heal himself. So literally, he can't do something here. And so we're looking at Jesus, and we're talking about salvation, and that's what Jesus is doing, but we can't see it. Because all we see, or all these people see, is a criminal on the cross. And it's getting darker. Literally, verse 33. It says, at noon, darkness came over the whole land until 3 in the afternoon. So for 3 hours, it's dark. At the brightest part of the day, when the sun is at its peak, it's dark. Everything is, and at this point, it appears that all of a sudden the mocking stops. If we're standing at lunchtime, looking at this guy dying, and then all of a sudden everything goes dark, maybe it does make you stop and think for a minute. You go, something is going on. He was crucified at 9. At noon it goes dark. And from noon until 3, for those 3 hours, it's dark. Lots of different reasons why people think that what the darkness represents. Some people have talked about how maybe God just didn't want to look at his son anymore on the cross, so he makes everything dark. Darkness and the brightness of day is also, if you remember from our study of Revelation and other places, it's the sign of God's the judgment. That God, when you see the sun darken like this, it's God doing something and passing judgment. And you can see that Jesus at this point is in the dark. All he's got is people mocking him, giving him insults. No good things going on, and he's hanging there in the dark. Here's a picture of that for me. Middle of the day, dark. Some of us, if you were standing there at the cross then, you would hear Jesus say, and at 3 in the afternoon, Jesus cried out in a loud voice, Eloi, Eloi, lama sabachthani, which means, my God, why have you forsaken me? And we read that in Psalm 22. And remember again, that's how they refer to the Old Testament passages. So Jesus is thinking back on Psalm 22, and he's thinking about that psalm while he says to the people, but imagine being in the dark and near the cross and just watching the suffering going on, and then suddenly, out of nowhere, comes this big cry that Jesus has. My God, why have you forsaken me? You can see the despair that Jesus is in. We want to keep from thinking kind of a romanticized version of it where like Jesus was, kind of happy to die on the cross. He's not. This is suffering. This is hard. This is a deep down despair. And as he's hanging there, he's been hanging on the cross for 6 hours, and he can't get hardly any breath, but when he does finally get up that breath, this is what he says. He doesn't say, take me down from the cross. He says, why have you forsaken me? Why is this going on in my life? Now he knows, but he wants us to know of what's going on in his life. The darkness, the mocking, and just making an observation that as we read this story, as we look at these things, we can never really understand what Jesus went through on the cross. The separation from God, the mocking, the physical pain, the inability to breathe, all of that for no reason. He's not guilty of anything. He hasn't done anything wrong. He hasn't done anything to deserve to be on the cross. He's doing that because the rest of us need him to do that. And we can never really understand what that felt like for Jesus. It was probably way more extreme than anything we will ever go through. The darkness. Interesting that it's when Jesus cries out, it says that the darkness goes away. Because it says that it became dark at noon, and it was dark until 3. At 3, Jesus says, that's when Jesus cries out. So the darkness ends when he cries out. So that's the first sign that maybe something is happening here. Because suddenly there's light. So when he says, my God, why have you forsaken me? And that's when God answers the prayer, shines a light on his son, looks at what's going on. God has heard the prayer, is almost a symbolism there. Now, going to have to finish the suffering, going to have to go on through the cross, but it's the first sign that something is going on here, that God is about to do something. In verse 35, it says, when some of those standing near heard this, they said, listen, he's calling Elijah. That's the Eloi point. That's a little bit of an odd jump maybe for us, but in terms of the language, it wouldn't necessarily have been a big jump to think he was calling for Elijah. Someone ran, filled a sponge with wine vinegar, put it on a staff, and offered it to Jesus to drink. Now, leave him alone. Let's see if Elijah comes to take him down, he said. And again, we look at that and thinking, someone's trying to be nice to him. Well, no, what they want to do is make sure he stays alive long enough to see if Elijah's going to come. See, they're still looking for some magical thing to happen. And so they give him the little bit of nourishment so that maybe it will keep him alive a little longer until Elijah gets there. So then they're all looking around. Let's see if Elijah comes. And that's the picture. Again, not doing this because they're trying to be nice to Jesus. They're doing it because they want to see what happens next. They want to prolong the suffering. They want things to progress. And maybe they'll see some exciting thing, like earlier when Jesus calmed the storm, or when Jesus healed somebody. Maybe Jesus will do something. So let's give them something to drink to kind of sustain them a little bit. And then maybe Elijah will come. But they misunderstood the whole comment that Jesus made. He wasn't talking about Elijah. He wasn't talking to Elijah. He was talking to God. That's what The El part is the Hebrew name for God. And that's the picture now of Jesus on the cross. He's hanging there, nails in his hands, nails in his feet. God maybe still has the thorn stuck in his head. He's been whipped. He's bleeding down his back. And he's hanging from the cross, and he can't get any breath. The thing about these crucifixions is that for many people, they lasted for days. They would be on that cross at 9 in the morning on Friday and still be alive on Sunday or Monday. Just from sheer being able. That's why later on we'll read that when they went to Pilate and said he died, Pilate's kind of like, what? He's died already? Because they expected him to live at least through the night. But that's not what happens to Jesus. Verse 37. With a loud cry, Jesus breathes his last. In verse 38, the curtain of the temple was torn in two from top to bottom. Somebody pointed out, as one of the commentaries I read this week, is that what tears the curtain is Jesus' cry. It's almost like a spiritual sonic boom, that when Jesus cries out, the curtain is torn. The curtain, by the way, is a big, heavy curtain. And it's 8 feet high or something like that. It's huge. And it says it was torn from top to bottom. Not like somebody could reach up there and grab it and tear it. It just didn't. It was too heavy, too big, too tall. But the curtain tears. And again, we have this picture that's a symbol for something. Something happened when Jesus died. There are 3 opinions as to what happened or why the curtain tore. Okay? This is your lesson for today. The torn curtain, first of all, symbolizes that the way into the presence of God has been opened. A lot of people picture that. The curtain hung in front of what was called the Holy of Holies, where the Ark was in olden times. And that's where God's throne was. That's where God was. And then only the high priest would go in. So when the curtain was opened or torn open, the picture could be that that allows everybody now to come into the presence of God. Jesus has died. He's paid the price for our sin. Now we can come in. The opposite, though, may very well be the case. That the torn curtain is to show that God isn't in the temple anymore. And if it's the opposite, God has left the building, so to speak. And now God is not in the temple. Remember, this is what Jesus had actually predicted. In a few years, not a stone will be standing upon another. This temple will be gone. And the first step then is the third thing, that the temple's destruction has begun. First thing that happens is curtains torn. You Jews, you think that God is there now in that temple? No, not anymore. The temple is done as a place of worship. We don't need to come into the presence of God, because God is now going to be in all of us.
Amen. And
we don't need to make sacrifices anymore, because Jesus is the ultimate sacrifice. So we don't need the temple anymore. And this is the first step in that process. Within a generation of this, within about 40 years, the temple will be destroyed and gone and hasn't been rebuilt since. And we don't need it to be rebuilt. The Jews don't need it to be rebuilt, because Jesus has provided the ultimate sacrifice, and we don't need to make any more sacrifices. And God is present with all of us now. We don't have to look to a building for God to be. And all of those things are part of this process. When Jesus dies, it's done. In one of the other Gospels, that's exactly what Jesus says. It's finished. We don't need to go back to any of that. It's all over with. It's all done from the moment he dies. It also says that Jesus breathed his last. Jesus gave up his life. He didn't hang on the cross try to hang on to the cross as long as he could. As soon as he reached a point where it was finished, he gave it up. He gave up his life. He breathed his last. And that again is the picture of Jesus giving himself as a sacrifice. Nobody takes it from him. He gives up his life. It's a sacrifice that he did for us. Now, we've been going through all of these things, and we're talking about how dark it is. Well, it's still pretty dark. It's still pretty ugly to watch this happen. Now, I know for us as Christians, looking back on it 2,000 years later and looking at it from the perspective of salvation and that God has done this and it's God's love and grace and mercy, so we kind of look back on it and we kind of sing joyfully about the cross and about but we always need to start from the place of, this is an ugly thing. It's not, there's anything beautiful about it. There isn't any except what it accomplishes, but the act itself is brutal, it's horrible, it's suffering, it's dark. Any adjective you can think of that talks about that, we need to think a bit about. There's nothing good about this, except for what it accomplishes. And that's it. Verse 39. And when the centurion who stood there in front of Jesus saw how he died, he said, "Surely this man was the Son of God." You know how many times anybody in the Gospel of Mark says or calls Jesus the Son of God? I'll give you a hint. This is it. Now, there are some demons who say some things like that, but no human being says anything like that. But you've got the centurion, who would have been the commanding officer of that company of soldiers that crucified Jesus. When he sees all of this, he sees the darkness, he sees the death of Jesus, he hears the cry of Jesus. There's even that kind of a hint that maybe he has some kind of sense that when Jesus breathed his last, even though he wouldn't have been at the temple to see the temple curtain torn, he knew something happened. And that's when the man says, well, obviously there's something going on here, isn't there? This is the Son of God. So the only person who says that Jesus is the Son of God in the Gospel of Mark is a Roman soldier who just met Jesus.
Wow.
Doesn't even know him, except that he watched how he died. And so my observation number 2 is, only in death is Jesus fully recognized for who he is. Something that we've been saying all along. Jesus was trying to get the disciples to understand this. He was trying to get them to see who he was. Over and over and over again, he kept healing people, and he did miracles, and he taught them, and he told parables, and he did all these things, and he wanted his disciples to get it. But we've been saying all along, they're not going to get it. Not until the death of Jesus, and even more, not until the resurrection. We don't really understand who Jesus is until we take into account his death. Why did he die? Who did he die for? What did his death mean? Then we start to get an idea of who Jesus is. See, a lot of people will look at Jesus and say, well, he's a good moral teacher, which is true. He was a guy that taught some really good things, and he showed us God's. It's not until you reckon with his death, that he suffered and died on the cross, that you begin to understand what's really going on with Jesus. Without the death, you don't get it. That's why we spend 40 minutes here talking about the death of Jesus. And it's why Paul says the main thing is that he died and was buried and rose again, because you don't get it unless and until you reckon with that, until you deal with the fact that his death meant something. if you just think, wow, it's kind of sad that this good moral teacher, he was crucified, and it's really a bad thing. And, well, no, there's all this forgiveness that's offered through the death of Christ, the sacrifice that he did, the suffering that happened. All of that is tied up in who Jesus is, and we have to keep that in mind. It's the main thing. Resurrection is the stamp on the death on the cross. It shows that God received the sacrifice or accepted the sacrifice. And we'll talk about that next week. You'll have to come back next week to hear that. Just a couple of verses here to kind of wrap it up is that while this is going on, it says, some women were watching from a distance. Among them were Mary Magdalene, Mary, the mother of James the younger and of Joseph, and Salome. In Galilee, these women had followed him and cared for his needs. Many other women who had come up with him to Jerusalem were also there. So when I say there was nobody there, all of a sudden Mark says, oh, by the way, there's this group of women who are over here, and they're watching all of this. Most likely, they're waiting for Jesus to die so that they can continue to care for his needs, as it says here. There's in Deuteronomy, there's a part of the Mosaic law was you didn't leave people on the cross overnight. As soon as they died, you took them down and buried them. That's what they're doing. And that's what these women are probably waiting for to do. And that's why we'll see next week, Joseph of Arimathea goes to Pilate and says, I want to take him down now. Pilate normally would have said, just leave him up there for a couple of days. We don't care. But the Jews said, no, we're not leaving condemned criminals up on the tree or on the cursed cross overnight, particularly because the Sabbath is going to start. And that's even more, it makes it even double important. So why does Jesus die? So that he can be buried. He can get all of this ready because Sunday's coming. Something's going to happen on Sunday. It's going to make all of this, change our perspective on all of this. But you can imagine being one of those disciples who goes to bed Friday night knowing that Jesus has been buried, having heard the stories of all the things that happened, and then spending all day Saturday wondering what's next. What's going to happen? Jesus is dead now. Shall we all go back to Galilee? Jesus is in the grave. Does that mean this is the end? How do you keep a congregation in suspense? I'll tell you next Sunday. So I was thinking about Corinthians again, and this passage comes up about the crucifixion. 1 Corinthians 1, verse 21 says, For since in the wisdom of God, the world through its wisdom did not know him, God was pleased through the foolishness of what was preached to save those who believe. Jews demand a sign, Greeks look for wisdom. But we preach Christ crucified, a stumbling block to Jews and foolishness to Gentiles. But to those whom God has called, both Jews and Greeks, Christ is the power of God and the wisdom of God. You worship a criminal who was crucified, put on the cross? Isn't that kind of silly? Isn't it absurd to think that that would be the thing that would save you? And that's where we get the kind of whole idea that God works in our weaknesses and that God works in our foolishness and that God works in spite of us and all those things. Because that's what God does. He wants to show his wisdom and his power. And so he uses things that the world thinks doesn't make any sense. But that doesn't work. You can't kill one person and then forgive all the sins of everybody else. That makes no sense, right? How does that work exactly? How does the blood make you white as snow? No, it doesn't make any sense. And this is why we have to pray for people who don't believe, because they see it as foolishness. It's a stumbling block. And also, by the way, it means we don't want to put anything else in their way either. Because the main thing that we preach is a stumbling block. So we have to live above reproach. We have to live better than other people. We have to be that way. Otherwise, we put more stumbling blocks in front of people. And we don't want to do that. The cross is enough. Doesn't make any sense. Doesn't work like that. So all of you are fools. All of you are crazy to sit here and listen to the pastor read a story like this and then say, wow, aren't we glad Jesus did that? I'll have to pray for people. Because we recognize, according to Paul, that Christ is the power of God and the wisdom of God. So take encouragement from that. That everything we talked about today is actually demonstrating the power of God and the wisdom of God. Let's pray. Our Father, I thank you for giving us your Son. I thank you that you provide a sacrifice and that you accept this sacrifice for my sins. And I thank you for the forgiveness that that represents. I thank you, Jesus, that you went through this. As we have looked at this today and looked at the suffering that was involved and the mocking and the insults and the pain and the abandonment. God, we can't even begin to understand how that worked in your life, but God, we are so thankful that you did it. We are thankful that you took it upon yourself to die for us. God, we do ask you for forgiveness. We ask you to forgive us for treating this sacrifice lightly. We ask you to just continue to fill our hearts with your grace and mercy and remind us every day that you love us and you want to forgive us and you want to bring us into a relationship with you. And so, God, as we throw ourselves on your mercy, we are thankful that you do accept us. And God, we look forward to next week when we will celebrate the resurrection, the new life that comes when we recognize our need for forgiveness, when we recognize that the sacrifice has been accepted, and that we can then rejoice and be glad.